Mayosha Meta by Risha Miriam.
Mordechai ben Shena,
Mordechai ben Shena.
Meir Leib ben Leah.
And Leib ben Leah.
Meir ben Liba.
Meir ben Liba.
Rachmiel Moshe ben Rachel.
Rachmiel Moshe ben Rachel.
Torah bas Esther.
Torah bas Esther.
Marissa bas Tobi.
Marissa bas Tobi. Bram ben Gittel. Rav Rafal Yisrael Yaakov ben Bela. Hannah bas Leah. Shoshana Tova bas Esther.
Okay.
Cover everybody.
I think that covers
Holy Israel.
Holy Israel. Okay. And even I didn't realize that there were Jews in UAE.
Yeah.
That there's a small community there, so they need another bracha to.
Yeah, it's very exciting possibilities now.
Yeah. I don't see our Israeli ambassador on yet. Okay, category 3 yard sites this week. Okay, that's it. I think my part is over.
Okay. This week, of course, is coming up with Chodesh Elul. Friday, we'll stop blowing the shofar. I don't know if we're going to have a virtual shofar for everybody to hear. You know, every turn of the page is a new challenge for all of us. As you just mentioned about davening, now comes Elul. Elul brings Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Mitzvah Hashem will weather it all. The Rebbeinu Shalom will give us the proper chizuk, and we'll continue to do everything we do as Ohevei Torah and Ohevei Yisrael. We're on Yud Amud Aleph. I would say about 8 or 10 lines, or maybe a dozen lines from the top. We stopped last week in the discussion of the machlokes that we had. Machlokes, what I say, l'shem shemayim. Machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan, and the subject matter is whether or not one can be a shliach, or one can, actually be a shliach for someone else when it comes to a Metzia. And that's what this Mishnah had started on Testament Bays. We were talking about if someone was riding on an animal and he saw a Metzia and he asked someone to pick it up for him, whether or not the person who picked it up can be zeicha for himself or only for the person who asked him. So it's a continuation of that discussion as to whether or not someone can pick up a Metzia on behalf of somebody else and what the issues are. So that's the subject matter. And we'll start today with Rav Nachman Rav Chizdes, so towards the end of the line. Rav Nachman Rav Chizdes Amud Travail, Yud Amud Aleph. All right. So Rav Nachman is the same Rav Nachman who we had, who had a discussion with Ulla on whether or not the machlokes in the Mishnah is about an ani. In other words, the Gemara in Peah brought down the discussion of an ani who picks up Peah, whether he can pick it up for another ani. And there was also discussion whether an ashir, a wealthy person, can be a shliach for an ani. So there when we had the machlokes, if you remember last week, Rabbi Eliezer said you can, because you do two migos. The migo of an ashir can make himself an ani, and once he makes himself an ani, then he can be tofis for another ani. And the Rabbanan said, no, you can't do that. I'll accept one migo, then one ani can pick it up for another ani, but I won't allow an ashir to become an ani and then an ani for an ani. So
Rabbi Grauman?
Yeah.
On that point, because I had a chance to look this over on Shabbos and I still wasn't clear, is Rabbi Eliezer saying that an ashir can actually pick up the payah and keep it because of the fact that since he could make himself an ani and he would be entitled to it, therefore he can actually take it? Or is it more of a theoretical thing? In other words, does Rabbi Eliezer say that an ashir can walk by the farm, see the payah, pick it up and keep it for himself and keep walking? Or is it all theoretical?
Well, so according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's a two-step process. Theoretical in the sense that he didn't give up his wealth, but he could have. And because he could have, he can be a shliach for another ani. In point of fact, if he doesn't give up the wealth, he can't collect it for himself. So that part is a theory. But the theory says that since he could be an ani, then that's the first step process, which allows him to complete the process in the second step of being a shliach for another ani. Only if he gave up his entire wealth could he keep it, but that doesn't disturb Rabbi Eliezer in terms of the process. The process still allows you to take it and then turn it over. Right?
Thank you.
Right. And to your point, it's very interesting because now in the next few minutes when we start this Gemara, we're going to see a very interesting machlokes between Rashi and Ptosis and other Rishonim on this question of shlichus, on the question of shlichus. All right. So now, so Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda Omer, they say together, Hamagbia Metzia Lachavero Lo Kana Chavero. So they make a blanket statement that someone who picks up a Metzia for his friend, Lo Kana Chavero. He's not kind. Why? My Tama. So the Gemara says, Have a typhus l'balchov v'makom shechav la'acherim. So we have two competing principles. One principle is, and we've said this many times in the Gemara, Zocha la'adam shelo b'fanav, that you are allowed to be zoche. You are allowed, without someone's permission, to do something for him. I can do something for you without you being masking that I should do it. You may not like it, okay, whatever, but I can do it for you. So Vibalta, I can do it for you. I see a Metzia. It's a beautiful shiny watch. I know that you don't have a watch, your watch broke, whatever. And I say, you know what? I want to pick up this watch and I want to give it to Yale. Why? Because I'm a good guy and I like him and I know he doesn't have a watch. Zocha la'adam shaloi b'fanav. There's a competing principle, which the Gemara now is introducing us to, which again is going to have some issues in this context, and that is that have a typhus l'balchov v'makim shechav le'acherim. You cannot grab something for a balchov v'makim shechav le'acherim. Okay, in other words, Ruvain owes Shimon $100. He owes Levi $100. Comes Shimon and he says, you know what? I'm going to jump in here, and I know that Ruvain has this nice watch that's worth $100. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to take that watch on behalf of Shimon. Not on my behalf, on behalf of Shimon, because I know Shimon needs a watch. And since Ruvain owes him $100, I'm going to take that watch and give it to Shimon.
Question.
Yes.
Let's say he would have let's forget this for a minute, and he just sees the watch on the street, and he's not thinking anything. No prior thoughts of who should get it, and you just pick up a watch. Are you implicitly then owning it? If you didn't have in mind, let's say you just see a watch on the street, it's a shiny object, you pick it up, and it's in your hands. Has anything happened halachically, legally, by picking it up?
Yeah. So if you pick it up, and then without anything else, we say that you have made a Kenyan.
So obviously my question then would be, if what he did on behalf of his friend is not good, then is it his now?
The answer is yes, unless he, in his mind, had no intention of being kindness.
Okay, all right.
So what you're asking is a valid question.
I mean, the Gemara is telling us what it's not, but we can infer now. I mean, it's his. The watch is his.
The reason why your question is important in this context is because you clearly can pick anything up for yourself and be kindness. No issue. So the whole premise of the Gemara is, if you can pick it up for yourself and be kindness, you own it now. You can give it to somebody else. You have picked it up, you own it, you can give it to somebody else. There is no issue here at all.
Why the discussion then?
Why the discussion? Because we want to get to the root of the question, whether I can skip the part about picking it up for myself, skip it entirely, and say, I'm only picking it up for Shimon.
It's a matana.
Why would you ever want to do
It's a
that?
matana. It's a matana.
What's the difference between that and picking it up, acquiring it, and then giving it to Shimon? What's the difference?
Okay, so now to Chaim's point. I don't need a watch. I see a watch on the floor, beautiful watch, and I'm a nice guy, and I say, oh, this watch is perfect for Shimon. No, in other words, put everything else aside. I see a watch, this is a gorgeous watch. I'm going to give it to my wife. I'm going to give it to my wife. Mm-hmm. My wife needs a watch. I'm going to give it to her. I'm not thinking about acquiring it and then giving it of my own as a gift from me. I'm thinking, so the question then becomes, you're right. You could always do the two-step process because you can always acquire for yourself in any circumstance.
Yeah, but you can't avoid a two-step process unless you have limitation process. You know, it's always going to be, no matter what you think, it's going to be a two-step process.
Except
no matter whether you say, I'm going to acquire it for myself and give it to Shimon, I'm going to acquire it for myself and give it to my wife. You've got to pick the thing up, and then you got to give it to somebody.
Except that the Gemara tells us that if I pick it up without any intention of owning it, I skip that first step. I don't own it.
So why is the Gemara assuming that you can go in and read somebody's mind? I mean, if there were a court case?
Yes, I come into court and I say, and this whole question becomes, well, sir, didn't you pick it up and own it? If you picked it up and own it, then this whole question now is moot. And your answer is, but I never intended to own it. Look, as a practical matter, we're not talking practical. Practical, yes, you pick it up, you own it, it's over. Now I give it as a matana, no question. But the Gemara wants to take it a step further. We know you can do that. We know you can pick it up and own it, and now do whatever you want with it. Can you pick it up, not acquire it? Again, now in your machshava, can you pick it up, not acquire it, but only pick it up on behalf of someone else? That's really the underpinning of the question, is whether you can do something and skip that important step and allow it to happen. So
in other words, you can do the same thing and give it two different meanings.
But Jonathan, by picking it up with someone else in mind, that I'm Ruvain and I know Shimon needs a watch, and that's what's on your mind when you're picking it up, you're doing yourself harm because you've never acquired it.
That's right. You're giving somebody else's property ostensibly to a third party.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you pick it up and you have no intention to do anything with it, but you think your intention is, well, I'm going to pick it up. Well, maybe it's so-and-so or somebody from shul. I'll take it to the shul, give it to the rabbi, see if somebody lost it.
Right.
If somebody says it's mine, it's his.
Right. You can do that.
Other than that, I'll leave it on the floor. Somebody else will take it.
Right.
So at least this way.
But don't you have to go through a process of finding out, doing due diligence to find out if in fact it was Hefker? You have to have some sort of public notice, no?
No. Okay. So we have to hold off. And the Gemara will tell us under what circumstances you don't have to do that. In other words, if you find it in the Rishus HaRabim, you can be a good Samaritan, Rick, any time and say, I find something on our Kola and Lamberton, it's a Rishus, or let's say it's a Rishus HaRabim, but you know what? I know someone in this community dropped it. So I can be a good Samaritan and go to the rabbi and say, Rabbi, I found this. It's a Rishus HaRabim, but I think someone may have found it. Let's make an advertisement. If no one answers, fine, I'll take it. You can always do that. The question is, do you have to do that? So the answer is, under certain circumstances, you don't have to do it because it's a Metzia. It's a Metzia, and a Metzia is open to everybody else. That's what the question is. In our Gemara, just to answer all the queries, is the whole point of the Gemara is to delve into the depths and understand what is pshat shlichus, what's pshat, you have a machshava to do it or not to do it. The simplest thing always is pick it up, I'm kind of it. End of story. The book is closed. What I do with it is my business. I own it. But
if there was no Yeush, there's no Kenyan at all, right?
Right, but we're assuming that something that's found in a certain place, i.e. Rosh Hashanah, let's say that there's automatic Yush. We're assuming there's Yush because it is a Rosh Hashanah. You're right. If I'm a Yid who says, you know what, I'm the Flim L'Shur Sadin, it's a Rosh Hashanah, he was Mayayish, but I want to do the right thing. You can always do that. The Gemara doesn't say you can't make an attempt to do Shabbos Aveda or anything like that. But we're talking in a practical circumstance where he's not such a nice guy, he's not a big tzaddik, it's an expensive watch, he sees it, either he wants it or he wants to give it to his wife as a gift, or Shimon needs a watch, whatever the case may be. So we're positing in the broadest sense of the word, what is the circumstance, what is the halacha in such a circumstance? That's
Rabbi?
in the broadest sense of the word.
Getting back to David's question, if you see a watch, you see it on the street, you say, oh, it must belong to somebody in the shul, and you bring it over to the shul and you leave it there for somebody to claim it. What's the ownership? Did I acquire it when I picked it up? Did I?
Not if you did. No. If you intended it as a Shabbos Aveda, you can always say the following. You can make a condition. This is an Aveda, it's a Metzia, I want to own it. I am going to pick it up with the idea of owning it, but I want to first make sure that there's nobody who can actually claim it. But because I picked it up and made a Kenyan, it's mine to do what I want with it. I made the Kenyan, I picked it up. But what I want to do is so I own it. It's mine now. It's not anymore Hefker. But I want to see if anybody else can make a legitimate claim by saying, it has an engraving, it has whatever, some particular siman. And if not, I own it. It's mine. So you can own it on condition to see whether or not someone will claim it. That you're allowed to do.
But I don't want to own it. I just want to turn it in.
If you can always decide in your mind, I'm picking this up not with the intention of making a Kenyan. You control that. You don't automatically make a Kenyan because you pick it up if you don't have a machshava to make a Kenyan.
Can somebody else take it from you because they want it if you haven't made a Kenyan?
Well, exactly right. And the Gemara has told us in certain circumstances that if I do something, remember the case of the talis.
Yeah.
We said when two people picked up a talis and the talis still was dragging on the floor. Talis was dragging on the floor. There wasn't a complete hagbah. If there wasn't a complete hagbah and a third person came and picked it up, guess what? He just made a Kenyan. The third person made a Kenyan because the first two who picked it up didn't make a Kenyan. It was still dragging on the floor. It was never a complete hagbah. You have to have a complete hagbah. So there's one circumstance where you didn't complete the Kenyan. But if I pick it up and don't have the and I don't want to own it, so to your question now, that's a very interesting question. If I don't want to pick it up and don't want to own it, and then someone comes and grabs it out of my hand before I do anything with it, and he says, I'm making this Kenyan, query whether or not he owns it, because again, we don't know the machshava of the first guy. But if the first guy were to say, I never intended to own it, I intended it just to give back and see if somebody else owns it. So you never make the hagbah for purposes of Kenyan. If in that circumstance, it's highly doubtful because it looks like you picked it up. But if someone comes by and grabs it from you and makes a Kenyan, and we're going to see this from the next Gemara as well, he made a Kenyan. You never had a Havamina to own it. He makes a Kenyan with the idea of Konet. So you need two things, Scott. You need the actual Kenyan, in other words, the Hagbah, the Mashiach, whatever, and you have to have the requisite intent to own it. If you don't have the intent to own it, we can't force upon you ownership. I can't say, this is yours because you picked it up. I don't want it. It's not mine. I don't want it. So it has to be machshava.
Unless you break it.
Unless you break it. Right. But if you voluntarily pick it up, then the question is, do you own it? So again, to get back to our scenario.
Just one quick thing. So if I find a wallet on Arcola Avenue, and the person obviously was Miyash, okay, and I see though it has the person's license and credit cards, and it has a couple $100 in it. Halachically, is it really my wallet now, and I can take it and just be done with it because he was Misiyash on it?
So you have the moral obligation.
I understand Kedoshim Tiyu, and I understand
No.
consciences and all that, but in terms of halacha.
Well, okay, so
this is also, you're not going to be Megayish also. It's just not going to happen.
Right,
you're not going to give up.
Right, the likelihood is that someone who loses a wallet with all of the credentials in it isn't necessarily miyayish.
Okay, all right.
So you always, no, Chaim, you always have to take the position that if I see it and I can identify it, that it's not yiyush. Otherwise,
so in other words, large public freeway doesn't necessarily constitute automatic yiyush.
In our religion, right? In our thinking, it does not. If you find that wallet in a public thoroughfare without any identification, then you can assume yiyush. Then you can assume yiyush because
and I would
no
like
way.
to
What?
say that Rabbi Grauman, I would say that even in Arcola and Lamberton specifically, because like we say that it's even a carmelit, it's not even Rishut Arabim. It's such a small area that you know who's it's going to be more likely. Versus say you drop it on the side of the beltway that falls out of your car.
Absolutely. That's why I'm saying that Arcola and Lamberton is not even a Rishut Arabim from the practical standpoint.
Exactly.
And in that location, one can more easily identify an owner than on the side of the beltway where you see a wallet, and especially without a name, and you say, this could have been any one of thousands of people who just came by. So,
but let's say on a beltway or at Maryland House, if it has an ID in it.
No, an ID is a whole different story.
Then there's no use.
Then there's no use. We assume no use. Right.
Even if the guy's from California and you pick it up in National Airport, you can still get it back to him. It's still possible if he's got ID in it.
Look, how many times do we read in the paper about occasionally there is a good Samaritan who finds something and he takes off and goes to another part of the world, and all of a sudden there's an address and someone gets a box with a wallet in it, and it's his wallet because someone did the right thing, right? So your question is it Geneva? Really, the underlying question is if you know you can identify it and return it, you have a moral obligation, and if you don't, it's Geneva because you actually can return it. So I'm not going to go so far as to say it's Geneva because maybe there was years, but clearly you have the obligation of at least making the effort. If you don't want to send it back, of somehow communicating with someone that you found an Aveda. Again,
actually, it happened to me when I lost my wallet, and I had the full identification, so I never gave up that somebody might return it. And about a week or two later, I got a call that they have my wallet. It was at the dump up in Gaithersburg, because I forgot, and I went searching all the other places I had been. Couldn't find, but I didn't give up until they called, and I accidentally, when they ask you when you want to turn in recyclable stuff like paints and stuff, they were asking for your ID. So I pull out my wallet, and then somehow I lost it there. But they returned everything.
Right.
It was really amazing.
Imagine this. Imagine how far people go. There's no identification. There's a credit card without any identification. So if someone picks up the phone and calls the credit card company, he knows it's a Visa, and says, I found a card here. I have no idea how to return it, but it has a name, right? It says Jay Parnas on it. Can I send it back to you? I mean, you know who Jay Parnas is because it's your card. So that far you can go and still have a Shabbos Aveda because you have no clue other than the fact that there is a name. He could be from Timbuktu. But since in our modern world, if you call the credit card company, they may be able to make the link to the proper owner. Query, do you have that obligation? A moral obligation? I would say yes. Right? A Shabbos Aveda is a big mitzvah. Is it Geneva if you don't? It's not Geneva if you don't. I mean, you may not even be able to use the card, or there may be money in the wallet together with the card. But imagine if you're able to do a Shabbos Aveda from such a circumstance, I think there would be a moral obligation on us to do it. But anyway,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more than that if you got a credit card, because if you give them the number, they have the guy's information, his address and everything else.
That's what I'm saying. So they can actually return it to him, even though you can't, because with today's technology, you know that card identifies someone. I can't know it, but the company can know it. So do I have an obligation?
Well, that's if I were to do that and try to use it, I'd be committing a felony using somebody else's credit card.
No, exactly right. So that would be
Credit card won't give. A credit card company will not give you a number, a name of a person.
No, but they'll say
I once found the card and I told them
They can
they
notify
can't give out.
Right. Okay.
Probably
Anyway,
call a person and cancel a number. Give them a
Right.
new card. I think.
okay. So back to our Gemara. So now we have these two competing interests: Zachal Adam Shalai Befanov, and the Ptosis the Balchay B'Makim Shechav Lachem Lakana. So they both say that you can't do it because it is a circumstance of. Now let's look at Rashi, because Rashi right away gives us an understanding. Tofus the Balchay B'Makim Shechav Lachem Ka'adam. It's like a person haba me'elav. He comes by of his own accord, but Tofus Maman Chavero, and he grabs or takes Maman Chavero b'shul chov sheyesh la'acher alav. I know that you owe money to my friend Shimon. I see that you owe him money, and you have a nice watch. I come over to you, and I take your watch. I take it. Not Geneva. I take it because I know you owe money to Shimon. You haven't paid him. So that's what Rashi. Ka'adam haba me'elav the tofis maman chavero b'shul chov sheyesh la'acher alav. Ubo lekodem ad shelo tifsenu bal chayv acher. And the reason why he does it because he happens to know that this fellow who owns the watch owes a lot of people money. It's known. He owes a lot of people money. And I come along and say, you know what? He doesn't owe me money, but he owes my friend money, Shimon. I'm going to grab this watch on behalf of Shimon. V'nimtza tofes zeh chov v'tfisoso zos es hadoshim acherim. So what is he doing? He's grabbing this watch to fulfill the payment to Shimon, knowing full well that this fellow owes a lot of people money he isn't paying. So that's how stark this is.
But he's putting himself as judge and jury in this case, or as himself as a based in the.
Right. Okay, you say judge and jury. Yes, the answer is yes, judge and jury. But put aside that legality for a moment, and let's just say these are known facts. It's known that this guy borrows money from everybody. He doesn't repay. I come along and I see he's wearing a very nice watch. I know my friend Shimon is suffering. And I say, I'm going to take action. I'm going to take this watch from him, right? It's self-help, but I'm going to take this watch from him to repay a legitimate debt.
I mean, he's pushing his friend to the front of the line.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And here, and the Gemara tells us that this theory of Tofes l'balchol b'mokim shechav la'acherim, that if you grab from a debtor, from a debtor, where this debtor owes money to others, that you cannot do. That you can't do. So next Rashi, chav la'acherim, mafsid es ha'acherim, the others will lose. In other words, it's a very nice thing that you're doing for your friend Shimon, but what about all the other creditors? Now, in our common law, in our American law, we know there are certain rules that when you take money from a debtor to pay a creditor, then depending on the circumstance, bankruptcy or not, whatever, the authorities can say you can't do that on behalf of one creditor. You're going to have to put it in the pot so that everybody gets something. Nobody gets everything, but everybody gets something. That's and halacha is the same thing. In other words, it's very nice that you want to help Shimon, but by helping Shimon, you're hurting Levi, Yehuda, and Yisachar, and that's not right. So in a circumstance where there's enough to satisfy everybody, then you can actually do that. You can actually do this, self-help, rather than going to Bezin. Okay, you can do that because there's no Geneva here. Maybe you should go to Halacha, you should go to Bezin and do it. But if you did it, and this fella has enough money to pay everybody, it's not an issue. The only issue arises when he doesn't have enough money to pay everybody, and he puts people in jeopardy. So again, says Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda that if you take Metzia lechavero, lo kana chavero because of tofes lebalchov b'makom shechav lacherem. Tofes lebalchov b'makom shechav lacherem lo kana. Okay, that's the principle. Now, take a look here. So let's look at the next Rashi. This is very important. Lo kana kedama b'ksubis the lav kol kamine lias kofetz me'elav v'chav le'elu ma'acha shelo oso osa hanosa shaliach l'tofus. So Rashi is telling us something very interesting. Rashi is saying that you yourself cannot take it on behalf of someone else, but if you made a shaliach to grab something for yourself, then you're allowed to make a shaliach to grab something for yourself. That's what Rashi's saying here. Because he didn't make a shaliach to grab it for himself, therefore he cannot take it on behalf of somebody else. We infer from here that if he made a shaliach to grab it, shlichus helps here. That's what Rashi's position is, that shlichus would help if he made a shaliach. Let's then look at Ptosis. Ptosis represents other Rishonim as well. Tofes lebalchov b'makom shechav lachem lo kana, says Ptosis mashipirish Rashi mishum d'lo also shaliach ein nira. No, Rashi is not right by saying that the reason why he doesn't get it because he didn't make a shaliach. Had he made a shaliach, he would have gotten it. Why? Because the Gemara there in Ksubis mashma gabi uvda the Yaimer by Choshu, this individual, the Tofes lebalchov b'makom shechav lacherim lo kana afilo also shaliach. We have a Beferish Gemara there in Ksubis, he brings down, that says that even with a shaliach, you cannot be typhus for yourself. In other words, shlichus doesn't help here. According to Rashi, Rashi is saying that under circumstances, shlichus helps. Comes typhus, and the Ritva and other Rishonim also say, nothing doing. Rashi, you're not right by inferring that shlichus would help. So it's very interesting because it's a side point, but Rashi is sometimes off the main topic. He introduces something like he does here and says shlichus. Why? We're not talking about shlichus. But Rashi happens to say, what? He didn't make shlichus, but if he made shlichus, it would be okay. Says Ptosis right away, no, Rashi, don't go out on a limb here and say shlichus would help because we know from a Beferish Gemara. Rashi can say what he wants, but he can't argue with the Gemara. The Gemara there in Ksubis, in that particular case, says that he picked it up as a shlichus. He sent a shaliach for somebody else, and it's not good. So shlichus doesn't machlokes, but let's say Barabin that the Ptosis brings down the Gemara that it's not the case. Anyway, it's an aside, but it's an interesting point. So now we haven't made any point yet. We're just making a statement that you can't pick it up on behalf of anybody else. Frek the Gemara, Esave, Rav Nachman. Rava asked a question to Rav Nachman. Okay. Mitzias poyel atzmo. Following circumstance. I am a day laborer, and I'm working on behalf of somebody else. And lo and behold, I'm working, and what do I find? I find an expensive gold watch on the ground. Okay? Mitzias poel la'atzmo. A mitzia poel, says the Gemara, la'atzmo, it belongs to me. La'atzmo, to me, to the person. So if I am working for you, Chaim, I'm working for you, and you asked me to do something for you, and in the middle of doing it, I find a gold watch. It's mine. Zok the Gemara, B'med devarim amurim. When is this true that it's mine? Zman she'omalo balabayas nochesh imi hayom oda imi hayom. If my work for you is, you said to me, do me a favor. I need to pull all the grass and weeds from this area so I can do a major work. So you hire me to go ahead and do something specific. I specifically went ahead and cleared the trail. I cleared the walkway. I cleared, okay. Says the Gemara, since you told me, since I'm working for you to do a specific malacha, says the Gemara, then if I find that watch, it's mine. Aval Omer lo, if the balabos who hired me says, also imi melacha hayoim, work for me today. He didn't say clear the path. He didn't say do this, this, or this. He just says, I'm hiring you for the day. I want you for the day, work for me. Zok the Gemara mitzi also shel Balabayas. In that case, the Metzia, the watch that he found, doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to the Balabayas because he's working for the Balabayas all day.
In
and
a general
up the
sense.
Chayfetz, he's working for the Balabayas, right? So
That gives the worker the status of an Evid in that case, right?
okay, so before, yeah, I mean, we're gonna get to the questions of Abdus or whatever, but let's consider him just a pile right now. I hire you to work for me. What's pshat work? I can give you. You can dig a ditch. You can bake a cake. You're working for me for the day. Anything you do is for me. I'm paying you a lot of money. I'm paying you $100, and I want your services today. You find a object. That's part of the work that you're doing for me. You're under my Abdus. So before we get into this whole question of whether or not there's Evid or Shlichus or everything else, on the surface, there's a chiluk between I'm asking you to do a particular job. Now, Rashi will tell us in a minute. If I ask you to do a particular job and you find this Aveda, and let's say you take 5 minutes, you speculate to do it, I can dock you 5 minutes of pay because you took my time for something for you, but I can't take it from you because that's not the charge I gave you. The charge I gave you was to do something specific. That's the only avodah that you're doing for me. You do another avodah, yes, I can take away time because it's Gezel Zman. You took my time away, but I can't require you to give me the watch.
Rabbi,
So that's why the Gemara says, "B'med devarim amurim," only when you gave him a specific task. But what's the bottom line, Scott? Before you ask, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is, so we see from this that if I tasked you with work for me today and you picked it up, it's mine, the balabos. So you see, someone can pick something up for somebody else. You, Reb Nachman, just got through saying, right, that you can't pick it up for someone because someone else may be the loser. Why is it different than if I charge you with working for me and you're working for me and you found that watch still belongs to somebody else, clearly. But yet it's mine. You can pick it up from on my behalf as the balabos, even though someone else may be the loser. That's the kasha he's asking here. You understand that it's a clear kasha from an example where someone's time was not his own. He owed the time to someone else, and because he owed it to someone else, what he found belongs to someone else. And here we have a Gemara that says that if I pick something up on your behalf, I can't do it because I'm taking from somebody else. That's the kasha of the Gemara here.
okay, I have a different question. It's off the subject slightly, and that is if somebody is on my property and they're working for me and they find something on my property, don't I own it by the mere fact that it's on my property?
So Scott, you're touching on the question of Hotzer, which we
Right.
had briefly last week. This is public. This is on the road.
Okay.
Okay, you're right, but we're not going to go in that direction. We're going to say, you're working for me and you're working on the road and all of a sudden you find something. You're right. The question of Hotzer is a question of, let's take Hotzer out of it for a minute, because that will we'll circle back to that. But here, it's simply a question of, you're on my clock. And if you're on my clock, the Gemara says that you own it. How can you own it? How can the worker do something on your behalf if l'chayra he's going to be possibly taking it away from somebody else? It's the same question.
Why can't he say, I'm taking out 5 minutes from what I owe the boss, and whatever happens in 5 minutes is mine?
How do you have a right to take 5 minutes when the 12 hours that you're working, the Balavas didn't give you permission to take 5 minutes, and you and
depends on the contract arrangement, because if somebody's hired for the whole day, typically they're given time off to eat.
Right. Okay. So now we're clearing in different directions whether or not that 5 minutes belongs to him or belongs to him. But what we see from here, the principle is that if he found it while he was doing the work, there wasn't time off. That's a separate question. That it belongs to the balabas. If it belongs to the balabas, then we see that there is shlichus here. We see not shlichus, but that you can do something and do it on behalf of the third person.
Who doesn't even know about it.
He doesn't even know about it.
Yeah.
So before we go any further, let's look at the teretz, because let's go back from Amalei. So Reb Nachman said to him, no, it's no raya. Shani poel the yodo ki yad balabayas. A poel is different because he is like the yad of the balabayas. In other words, we learn the whole issue here is that since I hire you, you're my alter ego. So he wants to say that in the question of a poel, it's not the question of a metzia. A metzia means I, of my own free will, walk along and I pick something up and I pick it up on your behalf. Okay? No strings attached. I don't owe you anything. You don't owe me anything. I am picking it up for you. One situation. In a case where you're my hired worker, you're not doing anything of your own volition. Your time right now is not your time. It's my time. I paid you for that time. So whatever happens in that time, it's Genei B'Zman, Genei B'Zdas, whatever. But so in other words, we want to make a distinction that since he owns it, Shani Polo, the other, therefore it's not a raya.
So the balabas is absolved of the requirement to do a separate Kenyan. The Kenyan is built into Metzia.
Correct. There is a concept of yodo of a poel is Yacht of Balabayas, and the Balabayas has to do nothing, but by virtue of paying the fellow, he owns his time, and because he owns his time, he owns everything that happens in that time. Okay. Correct. The Gemara. Okay, so this is no longer a steer on Reb Nachman, because Reb Nachman can say that if someone picks it up on behalf of someone else, no good. It's different when you're a worker, because when you're a worker, then you're in a different category. That's what the Gemara wants to say. Correct. The Gemara. V'ha'omer Rav, but wait a minute, not so simple. Rav says, Poel yochel lachzer bo, afilu b'chatzi hayom. Rav stated a concept that what? That this is, David, to your question. In the middle of the day, this is not Abdus. This isn't servitude. I'm paying you a wage. You are allowed in the middle of the day to say, you know what? I've got to stop working. Don't pay me anymore. I've got to stop working. I have an errand to run. My wife needs me somewhere else. I have an emergency. Or, you know what? I'm tired. I don't want to work anymore. You have that right. You're not an Evid. You're a worker. So says Rab, Poel yochel lachzabo afilu b'chatzi yom. Right? So he's allowed to do that. So then he goes back and says, Omalei, kol kama deler hodebe ki yad balabayas hi. Ki hodebe tama achrinahi. So he says to him, you know what? You're right. But as long as you're working, you agree that yodo ki yad balabayas. In other words, what your kasha isn't a steer to me. I'm saying that if I have control over you as a worker, it's different than any other circumstance. You're telling me, but he has a right to stop in the middle, and to say, I no longer work for you. In other words, here he's walking along, working hard. He sees a gold watch, and he says, I'm calling it quits. My day is over. Okay, I worked 5 hours instead of 12, pay me for 5. Now my time is mine, and I pick up this watch, right? So, in other words, he can do that. He can do that. So the Gemara says, yes, but now you're going into a whole different circumstance, and the halachas are different. Why? The reason why he could do that is not because it gives him the right to go ahead and do something on behalf of somebody else. It's more an ecclesiastic halacha. Okay, so in other words, now we're getting into a different realm where a person can always relinquish or step away from servitude because of the pasuk ki avodai haim, that you are avodim to the Rebbeinu Shalom, not avodim to somebody else. Now, the term Evid here, we just raised the term Evid. He doesn't mean Evid in the classical sense that I am an Evid, that I am a slave or someone. Okay, the term Evid here, for our purpose, is that you have a right, whether you're an Eved or whether you're working for somebody, you have autonomy. In other words, you always have the right to say, I am an individual and I have no master but the Rebbeinu Shalom. So in theory, if you're an Eved to somebody else, I mean a real Eved, like the Torah told us in this week's Parsha, right? We learned about Avodim, and the Torah told us in Re'eh that if you want to be an Eved La'olam, then you can be an Eved La'olam, etc., etc. So that's really Abdus. Now, you're not supposed to do it because it says Avodai Haim. You're supposed to be an Evid to the Rebbeinu Shalom, not an Evid to somebody else. So by introducing this, the Gemara is telling us a whole different parsha, and it's telling us that that's the reason why you can pull away. But the underlying question still remains: is that we see that Reb Nachman says that you cannot represent somebody else. You can't pick up representative because of this concept of a Ptosis l'balcho b'makom shechav le'acherim. And the Gemara wanted to say, but we see it from the case of a poel. The Gemara says, no, the case of a poel is not a valid example, because in the case of a poel, it's an exclusion to the whole question of shlichus, of being an eved or being representing somebody else. So it's no raya from here. So we're left here with no raya, and we still say that Reb Nachman is correct, that if you pick up a chayfetz, that you cannot directly represent to somebody else. Indirectly, you can own it and then give it to somebody else, like we said at the very outset, but you can't pick it up on behalf of somebody else because of this question of tofes la'atzmo. Now, again, you may recall that in the previous Gemaras, we referenced this Gemara. Does this Gemara talk about creditors, or does it talk about a Metzia? So we have to take a look at Rashi, because we're okay. So just in other words, before when we said that he did a specific job, that when he picked up this Metzia, he wasn't working for the Balabayas. The only work he did for the Balabayas was the specific work of cleaning the street or digging a hole or whatever it was. The Kona Poel, and the Poel is Kona. He has to give from his wages the schar of the time. Be'iter kol shas hagba. In other words, if he took 10, 15 minutes to take this watch, put it in his pocket, whatever, then that time he has to give back to Balabos, but it doesn't owe it to the Balabos. However, Omelo osa imi malacha hayom, kol malacha shu osa malachas balabayas. If he said generically, just all the work that you will do in the next 10 hours is mine. The kona balabayas, alma hamabi metzia lechavera, kona chavera. Okay, so now we see that that belongs to him. Okay, so that was the Gemara. So the Gemara answers here, and the Gemara says no, that ki hoda be tamach. Who says Rashi? Hoda oma the chi hoda be harishus biyodo. That what we say that if he retracts the rishus in his hands, lav mishum that hashda lav ki yad balabayas. Who? No, he's always in the hands of the balabayas. Elatamach mini she'ena shalo ke Evid she'im bo lazav lo schor mikan ve'elach lachsabo yachsabo. Because you're always allowed to stop in the middle because of the ecclesiastic principle that one should only serve the Rabbanu Shalom. Again, not directly tied to this. So therefore, the Gemara wants to make the point that a poel, a worker, you can't bring a raya from this Gemara of poel to prove whether or not, or to ask a question whether or not a person can represent somebody else. Okay, so this does not. Now, there's still the machlokes, by the way. So before we leave this, I just want to make the point. We are talking about a case where you are taking from one creditor to give to another creditor. So let's be clear. If I'm a creditor and you, Rick, are a creditor, and Scott, you're a creditor, I can come to, and Jay is the debtor, I can come to Jay and say, I'm taking this watch because you owe me money. That's permitted because I'm a creditor. Okay? No problem. I'm coming to you and I'm saying, Jay, I'm taking this watch to give to Shimon. I'm a creditor, but I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for Shimon. My kavana is not to be kaina. If I'm kaina, end of story, we go home, no more issue. But that's not my kavana. My kavana is to take it from you to give to Rick. Therein lies the issue of whether or not I can skip that first step of taking it from me. I can take it from you to give to Rick while Scott is still owed money. That's the kasha here. We tried to give an answer and say, sure, you can do it because a worker who is working for somebody else can do that. The Balabas has complete rights on him. How does he have complete rights on him? Maybe that watch belongs to somebody else. Teretz is, when you're working for somebody, it's not the same as you're taking the chayfetz from one person to give it to somebody else. Not the same thing. So that's one distinction. The other distinction that the kasha is here is, and we had this kasha weeks ago when we had this discussion, isn't there a difference between finding a metzia and taking something that is owed? The case of a creditor is a unique case because there we have a principle, and that principle says that you may not take something, right? Tofes lebalchov b'makom shechav acherem is a specific principle. I can't take from you when others are owed money. But if I find a metzia, and that metzia I want to give to Rick, who is being hurt by that metzia? So this is the machlokes. There are those who say that even in the case of metzia, you can't take away from someone's opportunity because someone would have an opportunity to find that. It's not a creditor, it's a metzia. But generally speaking, and that's the halacha.
There's an infinite number of people who could have found that.
That's correct. Which is why the general principle is we don't follow that. We say that in the case of a metzia, you're absolutely right. You're not talking about a finite number as in the case of creditors. Creditors, you have 10 creditors, 100 creditors. Right. Here, the metzia can be owned by 5 billion people. Why do I have a chrayas not to pick it up for you because of someone else who doesn't even know about it? It's a Metzia. But just keep in mind that is a machlokes. There are those who take the hard line and say that what you do, the same halacha for a creditor is the halacha for a Metzia. But for our purposes, there is no shaila in this Gemara because a poel, a worker, is in a different circumstance. Okay, now let's just finish this Gemara. Amar Rabbi Ba'aba Rabbi Yochanan. Comes Rabbi Ba'aba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, okay, and he pronounces Hamavi Metzia Chavero Kana Chavero. Wait a minute. Okay, so again, different opinion. So he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if someone picks up a Metzia Chavero Kana Chavero, how can you say that? We know from our Mishnah that if someone picks it up, he has the opportunity to say it's mine. Our Mishnah just said that. Our Mishnah just said, he can pick it up and be zeicha with it. How can you make this statement that all right? So first of all, he's clearly arguing with Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda, who just got through saying you can't do it for the principle of Ptosis the Balchal b'Makam Shekav La'Acherim. But how can you say that when our Mishnah says you can't do that? Now comes the real issue, okay? Says that the Gemara, the Oma Tanoli v'loy Oma Zochali. Now it depends on how you said it. If you said Tanoli, give it to me, then you pick it up. You have an option of giving it to him or not giving it to him. The language matters. If he would have said, Zochali, please be Zoche. I'm making you a shaliach to be Zoche for me. What is Zoche? Zoche is to acquire it.
Yeah.
Zocha, then the minute he picks it up, it belongs to the guy on the horse, even if he doesn't have it in his hand. Because he said something different. He didn't say Tanoli, he said Zachali. Says Rabbi Yochanan, that's different than what you're telling me about picking something up and you're worried about maybe Chavla Acherim or this, that, the other. It's a different circumstance. He's not saying Tanoli. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, this distinction in language makes all the difference. Our Mishnah, if you look at the language of the Mishnah, what does he say? Tanoli. Give it to me. That's generic language of, you see that? Please give that to me. The fellow says, if he's a nice guy, he'll give it to him. If not, he says, I'm Zaycha. I picked it up. I made a Kenyan. What? Just because you saw it from the distance? Okay? It's not yours. Now, the next Mishnah will change our whole scope of everything in a minute. We'll have to wait for next week. But here he said Zochali. If he said Zochali, and the guy picked it up, it's imputed that he picked it up for the rider, even if he didn't give it to the rider yet.
Right.
Because
What if he says, I'll pick it up, but I'm not going to give it to you. I'm acquiring it for myself. If he said Zochali, that means you're acquiring it for him. That means it's a lost item. If he says, give it to me, you would at least think that maybe he owns it and he dropped it.
Very good question. And the answer is, again, what we saw from last week from the second half of the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say in the second half? The if he gave it to him, and he says, Ani zachisi botchila lo omer klum. If he gave it to him, and he said, but I was zoicha first, then it's nothing. But if he didn't give it to him, if he picked it up and didn't give it to him and say, I'm zoicha, then it's mine. If he doesn't say, I'm zoicha, then it's not his. So in other words, that second half of the Mishnah that says, Ani zachisi botchila, you have to say it. In other words, you go through the motions. I say please give that to me. You pick it up and give it to me. You can't come back and say, but I picked it up for me. The act of giving it to him changes it. But if I say to you, Zachali, if you pick it up and immediately say, I am Zeicher for myself, that's the key. If I say Zachali and you pick it up and don't say anything, it already belongs to the writer. If you pick it up and immediately say, Zachali, it's mine, you can override the command by saying Zachali, because the second half of the Mishnah shows us that when you gave it to the writer and you said Zachali, it's too late. But if you said Zachali before you gave it to the writer, it's not too late.
It's a silent assent case.
Exactly right. So we have to look at all the actions here. We have to look at what the writer said, what the guy on the ground said, what he did. If you say Tanali, then that's a general request. I can pick it up and give it to you, or I can pick it up and say Zachali. But if I say Zachali, and you say, wait a minute, Zachali, I want this watch for myself. If you pick it up and say nothing, it's immediately the writer. If you pick it up and say Zachali, it's mine, not. So that now, take a look at Rashi. Koroslo im yesh sviva dava hefke ein acher b'shor l'tafso. Oh wait, sorry, no, okay. So that's already the next one. So what do we have here? So we have here, there's no stira. We're left with the fact that in the case of a creditor, so let's be clear. In the case of a creditor, you cannot be zoicha for somebody else at the expense of other creditors, but you can, if you're a creditor, pick it up for yourself. That's how we started this whole discussion. And you can pick it up yourself and always give another creditor a matana. If you don't do it that way, you can't do it the other way, because then you are cheating other creditors from taking part in this chayfetz. That's the halacha, and that's what the Gemara is telling us. The case of a poel is different, because a poel has a worker has a specific obligation, and it's as if he is the balabas. He's not doing it for the balabas. The halachas of being a poel are different than the halachas of you're doing something as a shlichos or you're doing something as a random act. So there's no stira there. Comes Rabbi Yochanan and he says, he makes a distinction in the language of what you say. If you say konali or zachali, now we see language matters. If you say konali, then you're asking for him to do something to cement your relationship. If he does it, he does it. If he doesn't, you have no taina to him. But if he says zachali, then you pick it up, you are zoicha for him, unless you immediately say, I am not zoicha for you, I'm zoicha for myself. If you don't say that, then it's imputed that you were zocha for the writer because he said zochali. So that's how this Gemara comes out. Again, and then we have the shaila and the machlokes of whether or not picking up a metzia is similar to picking up an item as a creditor. When we have a machlokes, some say that it's the same. Others say it can't be the same because a metzia, you're not. The whole world owes a metzia. You can't say I can't pick something up because the whole world might be able to get to it. A creditor is something different. We know that a creditor has an obligation. The person has an obligation to repay. That's a chayv. You shouldn't get in the way of a chayv and select one person as opposed to anybody else. But there are those Mandar Amrim who say, yes, a metzia is just like a creditor. And okay, now, Mitzvah next week, we're going to turn this on its ear because we're going to include yet another theory. And that's why you see the beauty of the Gemara is everything we've just said, we're going to try to undo by introducing another theory which might change our mind. So we have to keep in mind what we just said. We'll review it quickly. But the next Mishnah is going to take us in another direction. Mitzvah next week.
Shkoyach.
Rabbi, thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
All right.
Sei gesund. Have a good week, everybody. A guten Chodesh.
Thank you.
Excited.
Thank you.